How we take a Graco Contractor gun, remove the internal packings, clean them, and put the gun back together again. And in this task, you're going to need several items. You're going to need a crescent wrench. You'll need a 5/8" box wrench. I use a little tiny screwdriver to remove the O-rings from the internal packings to clean them. And then I also use a 9/32 socket to actually remove the pin that actually holds the internal packings inside the gun. And to start off this task, you're going to want to squeeze the trigger on this gun. You're going to take your 5/8" wrench, and you got to squeeze this trigger. If you don't squeeze this trigger, the needle seats on the end of the gun on the inside here, and you're actually going to start turning this, and you can actually score the needle, and then when you take and put the gun all back together again, you could get paint that actually leaks out of the end of the gun. So you want to make sure you hold the trigger down. You're going to take your 5/8" wrench, just unscrew both ends of the gun. And I just keep holding the trigger down. It's vitally important to hold it down when you're doing the fluid side section of the gun. We're just going to unscrew that, and out the end of the gun comes off. Then you can release the trigger. We got this portion of the gun. Now I have a cup. I like having a cup to actually put my parts in as I begin taking the gun apart. Take note how the gun comes apart so you don't forget. So I have a cup. I also use a can that I have lacquer thinner that I clean the parts with. So I take lacquer thinner, I dump it into an empty gallon can, and we'll begin dipping our parts in there and cleaning it. And I like using just an old toothbrush to clean my parts. When I'm done with the job, I use Pro Gold Pro Towels to actually clean my hands, or at any time if I want to get the grease off my hands, any dirt and grime, I use those Pro Gold towels. So I got the one end of the gun off. So I'm going to begin taking the back side of the gun off now, continuing to use my 5/8" box wrench. Now we got both ends of the gun. When you take this end of the gun off, you're going to have a spring. Then you have one other part that goes on the end of the spring. You just dump that into your bucket. And now we have the needle, the internal packings that is set inside, and it's held by the gun, the real tiny bolt that goes through the gun. And in order to get that off, take a crescent wrench on one end, and I'll just take my 9/32 socket wrench on the other end. There's two ends to this, and they're both got 9/32 ends to them, and this is the trickiest part. And you got to unscrew the one end, and that real tiny bolt with two nuts on the end of it will come out. So that comes out, and it's just a tiny bolt, but it's got, you want to screw the nut back on the end so those don't get separated and lost. Dump that in the bucket. Now we just got this packings that'll just pull right out. We'll just dump that in our bucket. Now we have our gun. It's all taken apart, and we could actually dip that gun into our lacquer thinner and begin cleaning it. We got some parts here. There's a O-ring right here on this part of the packing, and with a little tiny flathead screwdriver, I can pull that O-ring out. And if the O-ring's in bad shape, you'll definitely want to replace the O-ring, and it'll come with new packings. If you're taking this gun all apart, sometimes if it's several years since you've cleaned it, it's a good idea to just replace the packings and put brand new packings in it. With the new packings come the new O-rings. So I got that one O-ring there I'm going to take off, and then I've got on the packings right here, I've got another O-ring right here. It's right inside there. That's where these little tiny eyeglass screwdrivers work to help get those O-rings off. If you pinch the O-ring with your finger, it makes it a little bit easier to get behind it. If you actually tear the O-ring, you're going to have to replace it, but I use a real tiny flathead eyeglass screwdriver. Pull that O-ring off, and now the internal packing there, the needle seat is good to go. Just drop that back in the bucket, and we're good to begin the cleaning process. I got some lacquer thinner right here that I just take and dip my products in, and I'll begin cleaning them with lacquer thinner. I'll drop them down in my bucket, drop down inside there. I'm gonna let them soak just for a little bit. And the soaking will release, it'll actually start to begin to eat away at any latex paint, loosen any latex paint up, and it'll make it a lot easier to clean. And then on this contractor gun, once we've taken the packings and taken the ends of the gun off, we're going to take this part of the gun apart that has a filter in it, and then we're just going to unscrew this. And that right there, now we can actually drop this in our lacquer thinner, take off our filter, we can clean that, and then we're going to drop all the parts together. It's been soaking in here for about 5 minutes, and I'll just begin cleaning all these parts with my toothbrush and get them all good and clean. Lacquer thinner loosens up all this latex paint, makes it come off really easily. I use my little Q-tips to get down inside these areas that my toothbrush can't reach. It's a good idea to use a pair of chemical gloves when you're doing this. For the sake of this video, I'm not using gloves to be able to work with the camera too. But you can get chemical resistant gloves for this type of stuff at your local paint store or a home improvement store like Home Depot. So I'm just going to keep cleaning these parts here. Just get them good and clean, get all the paint off of them. And once they're all clean before the lacquer thinner completely dries, I like to spray them with WD-40, and then I'll keep any paint that didn't come off or that I may have missed. It'll keep it from drying. I've spent about 30 minutes now cleaning my gun with my lacquer thinner. And I'm going to set my lacquer thinner aside, got my parts laid out. I'm going to begin assembling this gun back together. I've got two. I'll show you how the bottom of the gun goes back on too. And the bottom, to get your filter, is just going to drop back in there. Just going to screw the bottom of the gun back on. Pretty simple process. It just screws right back on. There's the bottom of the gun. The knuckle guard hooks right, latches right in there, and the bottom of the gun's reattached. Make sure when you take the top apart and get it all disassembled, pull the bottom of the gun apart too. Also clean that part of the gun too. This gun back together. I've got the two O-rings, and I like to take just like an O-ring lube. I just use this lube tube, and it's a PTEF or PTFE. And it's a lubrication that I put on the O-rings, and I clean the O-rings. I just use my Pro Gold Pro Towels, and I clean any dry latex paint off these O-rings, and then I'm going to lubricate them and put them back where they go. There's a large one and a small one, and in the large one, I put a little bit of lubrication on here and lubricate this O-ring, and this goes back on the front portion of the gun, and we'll just stick that O-ring right back on. And just make sure that thing's in place where it goes. And then there's another O-ring that goes on your needle. And so I already put this O-ring back on. It goes right here. And I'm going to put just a little more lubrication on that O-ring. And the lubrication on this one will make it insert back into the gun a little bit easier. And there's a hole right here, and that hole has to line up with the hole where that pin actually goes through the gun. So I'm going to drop this needle right down inside there, push it down, and I should be able to see right all the way through. And then I'm going to take the spring, and the spring's going to drop down in, the first thing in, this little cap right here looks like a little hat. The hat portion is going to drop up, and you want to drop it down so it sets right on top that needle that you just dropped in there. We're going to drop the spring down. And then I also like to take a little bit of WD-40, like to lubricate my parts before I actually put them back together too. And you could actually use packing lube or a gun lube too to also use to lubricate the parts before you put them back together. And I like to just lubricate, all the parts of the gun, and then I'll start putting it back together. And I got the needle there, got this in, so I'm going to tighten this. It's going to take my 5/8 inch wrench, tighten our spring down. I'm not going to tighten it all the way because I'm going to be putting this other part of the gun back together first. I'm going to take our little pin, I'm going to drop this pin down through here, this tiny bolt, make sure it goes all the way through. You may have to push on the needle a little bit to get it to line up. Not quite lining up here. Now just pop through. I'm going to take the little nut, we're going to screw that nut back on. You want to make sure these nuts get screwed on, this little tiny nut gets screwed on good and tight. You don't ever want this thing to come off. I'm going to use my tiny little socket wrench, my crescent wrench, to put that back on. Now that little tiny nut is back on, I can actually see that I've got my trigger pull back. It's good and tight. Now we're going to begin putting the fluid side section of the gun back on. Once again, extremely important that you pull the trigger on this gun, make sure that needle goes back, because if you screw it on without pulling the trigger down, you could score the needle and you could end up making the gun leak. And so I've got my handle that goes on here. I'm going to stick your handle on first. Pull the trigger. And begin screwing that back together. Keep that trigger pulled down the whole time. It's been about 3 years since we put packings in this gun, but I took them out. I'm going to reassemble it, test it out to see if it functions without leaking, if it's got good trigger pull, and if it functions properly, I won't put new packings in it. But you can pull the gun apart if it's been quite a while since you packed it, or if the gun leaks pretty bad and you disassemble it and you want to just put new packings in it. They're about $50. We get them from Sherwin's, and you can put it back together. But I like to clean the packings, put it back together, see if it leaks. If it still leaks, then I'll put new packings in it. But now I got the gun together. I'm going to squeeze the trigger, tighten that in. Now I'm going to tighten the spring side in all the way down so it's tight. And then straighten out my gun. The handle has a little Allen wrench screw. This handle will swivel back and forth. You can tighten up that Allen wrench to make sure the gun is good and straight. And now the gun's been cleaned, reassembled, ready for use. Hopefully it doesn't leak. If it leaks, we'll replace the packings.